Hello, this is Mr. Huff, and I want to go over some glider construction tips and tricks to make sure that everything is going to work out well for you guys at home. One of the things I want to talk about first is cutting your pieces. I recommend that you map everything out, use exact measurements for everything. Follow the plan very, very carefully. Mark everything out with a pen or pencil on the balsa wood, and then cut it out very carefully with either a craft knife or a box cutter. And again, when you're doing the cuts on these, what I would do is probably cut a straight line right here, and right here, and right here, all the way through to separate those pieces, and then cut these angles. I would also mark the center line here and the center line here, but not cut them. So remember, when you're cutting, don't try to cut through all the way through at once in one go, but you're going to make lots of cuts a little bit at a time with just a little bit of pressure. You don't want to, because if you push real hard as you're cutting, it's going to tear the wood, and we want to cut the wood. So lots of lighter cuts rather than one big heavy one to try to cut all the way through in one go. Don't do that. Also note that the wing is going to sit on the fuselage like this, and the grain is perpendicular to the fuselage. Does that make sense? And then the horizontal stabilizer will be glued on like this to the fuselage, and again the grain is perpendicular to the fuselage. You need to do the same thing with the vertical tail. It should have grain that will be perpendicular to the fuselage. If you rotate this tail 90 degrees, you end up with the grain going parallel to the fuselage, and it will be extremely delicate and will probably break, and that's not what you want. So make sure your vertical tail is positioned like this on your piece of balsa. It is important to mark all of these on your fuselage, where the front of your wing is, where the center of gravity is, where the neutral point is, where your horizontal stabilizer is connected, and where your vertical tail is connected if those are different points. I think on the designs I made sure that those two dimensions were identical, so but that's not true for the ones that were student designed. So you may have some overlap. And make sure you cut it to the right length. But you need to have these marked out very clearly so that when you're trying to balance things or when you're attaching things onto the fuselage, that you get them in the right place. So mark all of these things. Do not do this. If you sand your a rectangular wing into this cool looking shape, you're going to dramatically change the flight characteristics, and it probably won't work. So this is beyond what we're going to do in this class. A note about sanding the trailing edges on the wings. I prefer to put it at the edge of a table, and instead of just using a loose piece of sandpaper, I like to wrap it around a block or something so it's more rigid and flat, and then sand the whole wing at an angle. You want to avoid curving at the ends. It should be smooth and straight all the way across. It's easier to do this before you glue it on. When you look at the profile of the wing only, it should look like this. You should round the front of it, so just remove those corners, and then you should sand down the trailing edge. If you look at the profile of this, it looks a little bit like an airfoil, even though it's very thin. As far as the other components, your horizontal stabilizer and your vertical stabilizer, you don't need to sand those. Just leave them the way they are. This is only for the wing. So here it's telling you, make sure you glue the wing on straight and square. Let me talk a little bit about using supports. It is recommended that you design supports out of cardboard to help things remain stable. So things to help you keep the wings level with the fuselage. I saw students just cutting out little squares of cardboard and stacking them up and making sure that the wing was resting on those, especially if they attempted a dihedral. A lot of those guys, what they did is they cut the wing in half, and then they made sure it was elevated equally on either side of the body. If you want to keep things simple, though, just go with flat. So again, what my main point is here is use supports that you make out of cardboard to hold things flat and level, and hold things at 90-degree angles like the vertical stabilizer, so it needs to be straight up and down. Let's talk about gluing a little bit. This one kind of talks about it, but I'm going to talk about it with this slide that I made. So first thing you need to do is add a little thin layer of glue between the element that you're gluing to and the fuselage, really thin. So the idea is to get them held in the right position with a thin layer of glue. Squirting on a whole lot of glue at one time at the beginning does not make it strong. We want to use a thin layer of glue so that it sets quickly and is stable. Now, once it's dried, you can go back and along the edge where the fuselage meets another element, put a bead of glue here and a bead of glue here, and let that dry. And what that will do is it will stabilize that joint between the fuselage and the wing. So that's how you make it strong. It's 2 steps. A thin layer of glue to get it in place, let it sit, let it dry, and then reinforce that by adding a bead of glue down either side of the fuselage wherever a piece of wood is connected to it. This is true for the wing and the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer. It's not recommended that you cut your horizontal stabilizer in half. Okay, and it's got this where if you are connecting your vertical stabilizer in the same place, I have students every year, they glue the vertical stabilizer right on top of the balsa wood. It is delicate, but it works and it's simple, so let's do that. So I don't recommend doing this unless you can get them equal and exactly the same, and I haven't seen much success there. All right, let's talk about this little triangle. Okay, you should have on your plans a leading edge for your horizontal stabilizer. If you're making a canard, this is the front of the plane. And you're going to put this little triangle underneath your horizontal stabilizer, and it's going to tilt your stabilizer up. And what this is doing is it's counteracting the weight at the nose to try to force the nose of the plane up against the weight that's pulling it down. Now, if you have a horizontal stabilizer at the back of the plane, so imagine the front of the plane way over here, at the back of the plane, underneath your horizontal stabilizer, you need to make the triangle fit in here like this. And what this does is it pitches this down. And what this does is it pushes the back of the plane down to try to force the nose of the plane up as the plane flies through the air. So make sure you get this triangle in the right place. When you look at your plans, you will see that triangle not on the first page, not on the second page, but on the third page. It's this little triangle right here. What most students have done is they measure the centimeters here, and they measure the centimeters here, and they mark that along one straight edge of their balsa wood. I recommend cutting a little bit outside of it and then sanding it down to the shape. Another thing to note, you're not going to get a 3.35 degree angle out of something you're cutting and sanding by hand, but what you want to have is something close to about 3 degrees, and we can trim it out from there or balance it with more or less weight if you get pretty close. If you leave this out completely, it will be very difficult to trim and get stable flight. So you have to cut this out of balsa wood and then glue it as directed here for a canard where the horizontal stabilizer is at the front, or at the back like this if it's a typical layout of an aircraft. All right, enough about that. So we're going to use a wedge build because it's easier. There are some instructions here where you could sand it down like this, but again, I haven't seen anybody do this successfully. Again, we want to use a little piece of wood instead of cutting this because this becomes very challenging to get these to be at exactly the same angle on both sides. We will not be doing vertical stabilizer side mounts. You want to make sure it's centered in your fuselage, and if you are gluing it on top of your horizontal stabilizer, it's centered on that center line of your horizontal stabilizer that you marked earlier. Another thing you need to do, I included a small piece of fuselage in case you used one of the designs that uses the entire length, but what you're going to do is glue a little piece on here. You can sand the nose down a little bit like this, but you're going to glue this little piece on at the front of your airplane. And what this is going to serve as is a place to connect or to hook onto your rubber band so that you can launch it with a rubber band. For what we're using in class, we have some launchers that are built like this. This is basically a 1x4 board about 2 feet long, and I mounted another smaller board here underneath to act as a handle. And then at the front we have a screw or a nail in there, and then we tie the rubber band to that. So we will pull the rubber band back this way and have the aircraft attached to it, and this lets you pull it as far back as you like. It kind of gives you a reference point so you can tell about how far you pulled it. Feel free to add more rubber bands if you feel it's necessary, and you can come up with your own design, but this is basically what we're using in class for a launcher. You can invent your own, or you can kind of duplicate this. All right. While there are instructions for building the dihedral, over the last 2 years I've seen a lot of people try a lot of different things. None of them followed the instructions in this document with carving the little notch in there. Usually people just either cut all the way through or carve a little groove in the top of their wing so they can fold it a little bit and glue it down. If you want to attempt that, if your woodworking skills are on point, you can try that. It should make a more stable glider, just angling the wings up just a little bit, but it's not necessary. Let's talk about trim. Okay, the odds of you building the perfect glider are pretty slim. So what we will do is use pieces of tape to trim it and small amounts of clay to balance the glider. So in order to balance it, what you're going to do is you're going to hold the glider on your finger or on a number 2 pencil or something, or just along an edge or something where it can balance like a seesaw, and you're going to add weight at the nose until it balances when the plane is resting at the center of gravity. And then to balance it left and right, you're going to hold the plane on your fingertips, one right here and one up here, and you're going to you want the plane to not rotate. You want it to be level. So you can use a small amount of clay or a little bit of tape out at the wing tips to make it balance. It needs to be balanced before you just try to fly it. So front to back at the center of gravity, left to right, holding the fuselage, and the plane shouldn't rotate. It should balance like a seesaw. All right. Now, if your plane is rolling or turning, or if it's rolling or turning, you can trim it by adding a little piece of tape folded over the wing like this and like this. These will act as ailerons. Remember, in the paper airplane lab, you only had to make a small change to get a big change on your aircraft, and that's the same here. You don't want to make a piece of tape that goes along the whole edge of the wing. Overkill. Okay, you just need a little piece here, a little piece here, and you bend them in opposite directions to make it roll the way you want it to go. So what we're aiming for is straight and level flight. So that's how you could control that. You could also control turn. If it's not rolling but just turning, you may need to add a little piece of tape like this on your vertical stabilizer here. Same idea, just cut one little piece of tape, fold it around on both sides, squeeze it together, and then turn it so that it makes the tail move in the direction so that it makes the airplane fly straight. So that's 2 ways to trim for turning instead of flying straight. Now, the other thing you're going to run into is if you have a plane that likes to climb, so you launch it and it curves and goes straight up, or you launch it and it nosedives really fast, it's not flying straight and level, you can add pieces of tape like this to the elevator, or to act as elevators in the back. You bend both of these the same amount in the same direction to try to either make it climb up or to reduce the climb. Okay, so you have to think about how that has to move as a control surface to keep the nose level, straight, and flat. And that's how we'll trim these, is just small pieces of tape. Some people also found adjusting the weight at the front of the plane helps it to fly stable. So if it's climbing too fast, maybe take some weight off the front. If it's diving down too quickly, maybe take some weight off of the nose. So it shouldn't take a lot either way. All right, that's a little bit about trimming. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and we will try to get those resolved. Thank you so much for watching this really long video, but I hope it helps you build.